This is the Pharmaverse podcast. I'm your host, Michael Pietrack, engaging leaders from the pharma universe. Hello and welcome to the Pharmaverse podcast. I'm your host, Michael Pietrack. And if you're a leader or an aspiring leader in the pharmaceutical industry, you have come to the right place. And if you're curious about counteroffers, employment contracts, and negotiating job offers, you're going to love this episode because today's guest is Howard Matalon, an employment attorney with over 30 years of experience. He and his wife run an executive coaching platform called NAV, N-A-V. And he, along with his wife, Heather, also authored a book entitled Navigating Career Negotiations, which we're going to be touching on a lot during this episode. But also, he's a personal coach for pharmaceutical executives. And today, he's going to teach us how to advocate and empower ourselves. And his insights are absolutely paradigm shifting and will leave us seeing our careers and our employment really in a completely different light. So this is such an important yet not often discussed topic. So I'm very excited to dive right in. Howard Matalon, welcome to the Pharmaverse.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much, Michael. Appreciate everything.
Oh, yeah. I'm excited, like I said. So before we dig into the information of your book and the content there, give us just a quick overview of your professional credentials.
Sure. So I've been practicing law, as you said, for about 33 years. I also have a background as a professional in human resources, having taken the certification program at Cornell ILR. And I do executive coaching on the side. I've been doing that for probably half or more of my tenure as an employment lawyer. And it's amazing to think where the journey has led me over those 30 plus years.
Very impressive. And where I thought we could start is for you to describe the relationship between a social relationship and how that is different between an employment relationship. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So I think we make a lot of mistakes, Michael, in our careers, that we seem to think that our careers are just another evolution from our social relationships, when they're absolutely not. And I want all of your listeners and your audience, your viewers, to think of employment relationships in the right context. They are business transactions. You are, in fact, as we'll come to talk, you are, in fact, the asset. You're the asset for sale. And you're selling the most important resource on the planet, more than diamonds and oil. It's time. Time gets us our value. Time makes us our value. And employers are acquiring that value from us. Social relationships are an entirely different animal altogether. There are no obligations. There are no requirements. You're not beholden to anyone necessarily in a social relationship. But one of the fun parts of the book was trying to take an employment relationship and the misconceptions about it and put it in a social context. So if that were the case, like in a dating context, and I were the employer, I would say something like, I just want to let you know I'm going to enjoy our relationship for as short as it's going to be. I, of course, will be playing the field. You must be monogamous with me at all times. And I will be evaluating and maybe monitoring how monogamous you are with me. I will be cheating on you regularly. I will be looking for other opportunities if I find someone better to replace you. Oh, and by the way, if you decide to break up with me, I probably will insist that you stay away from certain individuals to actually date going forward. And I wouldn't want you to reveal anything about our dating relationship, except you could see where it goes and how absurd it becomes to the point where it doesn't resemble any kind of relationship. And that is the point. It is not. And I would challenge anyone to tell me that there is such a thing as an employment relationship. It is not. It is a negotiation between a buyer and a seller, and you are the most valuable asset on the planet based on your experience.
I'm glad you brought up buyer and seller because that was another takeaway from the book. Because I've been telling candidates for years that in the interview setting, there's this buyer and seller relationship. And inherently, during the interview process, the company tends to be the one that is the buyer, and the candidate thinks of themselves as the buyer at times, and it's kind of confusing. But your book talks about flipping the dynamic in an offer negotiation. Can you speak to that?
Sure. So everything changes once you start properly evaluating who is on the right side of the table, right? So for years, I think individuals have become kind of desensitized to the concept that somehow they are buying something from an employer, that an offer letter is something of value. An offer letter is a piece of paper. The employer is giving you an opportunity, but in fact, they're looking for you. You are the most critical asset here because to an employer, in fact, you're the most unique asset on the planet because you're capable of instantaneous organic appreciation value. There's no other asset on the planet that can increase in value the way a human being can because of our ability to
Hold on for a
process
sec.
information.
Explain that. So
Sure.
say it slowly and then explain what that means. That's really
Sure.
cool.
So you can take any, if we start looking at human beings as assets, everything becomes clear, right? You are a being that grows over time, learns over time, processes information like a computer over time, and you become the sum of all of your experiences. When an employer is hiring you, they get to take advantage of all of the time that you've developed as a human being, your experiences, your skill set, your business acumen, your personality, your ability to work well with people, all of the context that you've learned over however many years. That makes you the most unique asset on the entire planet. And we, in fact, have been doing a lot to cannibalize those assets, sadly. But the truth is that you are, and by the way, you will be, the greatest asset you will ever have. Better than any stock you own, better than any financial transaction you ever had, because you keep increasing with value as you learn and experience new.
So when you're sitting across from an employer, some candidates feel like the employer has the value.
Right, because
But
they're offering you a job. So because they're offering you something, they must by definition be the seller. That's the wrong way to look at that. The only transaction that's going on is I am offering you my time for a certain set compensatory rate. And because employers don't value employees the same way that we value ourselves, what can happen is you get shortchanged in the process. For example, you're hired at a certain dollar level, the employer doesn't give you more than a COLA increase, but you've worked there now 5 years. You've increased your value exponentially to the employer, and the employer is sitting there. It's the greatest return on investment they've ever had because your costs are static, but your experience keeps increasing. And that's why we say that your ROI needs to be properly valued as you move through every stage of your career. That's why you need to be mindful of where you are in your career trajectory and your growth, and why you need to be mindful of the additional compensation and value you have over time.
Yeah, I love that concept. When we spoke earlier, the imagery that came to my mind is like, think about a little kid that gets a shirt and it fits. Well, as they grow, the shirt no longer fits. And that's sort of like what we do with employment. We put a person in a shirt, they grow, but we expect them to still want that shirt and to wear that shirt. And it doesn't make sense when you put it in that context.
Well, right. So in fact, as an experiencer, one of my friends shared the story with me. They were working at a retail store and they finally got a chance to spend time with one of the buyers. They went to lunch and they shared with the buyer, I just can't wait to do what you do. And the buyer said, if that's your career path, you're already failing. You want to do better than me. I ended my career here. You shouldn't be where I am in your career. And that person took it away from there and went on to do amazing things in her personal career because she realized that this person had capped their own value, had capped and ended their trajectory where they never wanted to be. That's a lesson for us all, right? We have to keep on that great glide path if we want to do amazing things in our career, but we limit ourselves over time because we age.
Yeah, and there's other things that limit us, right? Fear, other things that you talk about in the book. What are some other reasons why people stay static in their career?
There are a billion reasons why people decide not to move. They have to sideline themselves because of an illness in the family. They decide that they need to change industries. And so all they can get is starting positions in a new industry. Or they take lateral positions, and all lateral positions doing is stalling growth, right? You're not necessarily moving forward. You're moving sideways in your career. And that's why we plateau. And if we ultimately plateau for too long a period or stay in a job too long, we actually foreclose doors of opportunity that we would otherwise have if we were sprinting along in our careers. And that's my biggest concern for people, that they need to keep moving forward. And employers need to calibrate for growth. which is not happening.
That is true. The calibration for growth. I see that a lot in companies, and they can't understand why they feel like the minor league system. They hire, they train, and then they watch their talent go. And, they have to continue to calibrate and give that person the market value based on the growth.
That's right. That's right. And human beings also need to look, the career professionals need to say, well, am I at the point now where, as you said, I've outgrown this position? And the employer needs to be honest and say, I can't do any better for you. I can't promote you. We already have a C-suite in your role. It's time for us to part company. But that honesty or that transparency isn't there because in a, capitalistic system, it's not to the employer's advantage necessarily when they've got a super high performing asset to give them that story and say, I think it's time for you to go elsewhere for your career.
Yeah, good point. One of the things that I think would be really valuable to the audience is most candidates that I deal with, I would say most people listening, if you ask them, how good are you at negotiating? They would probably say, oh, I'm pretty bad at it. And it gives them the most anxiety when they're receiving an offer is, man, if I negotiate this, am I going to burn up political capital and so on? But the executives that you work with, you really help them negotiate their employment contracts. Is that true?
Absolutely, all day long.
So what are the top, let's just say the top 3 bits of advice that you would give to someone that is negotiating either an employment contract or an offer?
Okay, so top 3 things. I would say the first is that you need to know everything you possibly can about your prospective employer. And putting it in a business transaction context is a great thing. So one of the things that my firm does in mergers and acquisitions is we do what we call due diligence, right? When we represent the seller, we want to know everything we possibly can about the buyer. Similarly, the buyer looks at the seller and says, what am I buying? What am I actually acquiring? So if you are, in fact, the seller of an asset, you want to know what you're getting yourself into. And we have a checklist in the book that might be helpful to the viewers. We go through just about everything you might want to think about when you're asking an employer, what's my job really going to look like? What's my team going to look like? Have anyone in this role before ever been fired out of the role? Have there been position eliminations? All the kind of questions you want to ask yourself, because otherwise you're assuming this massive knowledge gap that will lead, unfortunately, to a derailleur in the alignment between your expectations and the employer's expectations, right? Imagine coming into a business where you've never met the sales team, and what you don't know behind the scenes is 2 of the members of the sales team actually hoped to get the job that you were being hired for. So the day you start, you have a very disgruntled team on your hands because they brought an outsider in.
Yeah.
You would never take that job. You'd want to meet that team. You'd want to know what kind of pool of talent you're dealing with and your span of authority of control and everything else that goes into obtaining a new position with a complete stranger, right? No matter what they tell you, you need to kick the tires. You need to drive the car. You need to do what you can to understand where you're going with this business. So that's number 1.
Hold on. Let me stop there. So number 1, you're saying due diligence, you can actually negotiate to help do more due diligence. Is that what you're saying?
So what I'm saying is that when you're negotiating, you need to know everything you can factually about your new employer.
I see. Okay.
Because otherwise what happens is you start in a position that is entirely different from your expectations, right?
Okay.
Imagine if you don't know, for example, that the employer is going through a layoff, right? They're actually eliminating positions. You have this certain set of expectations about the company you're joining, and then you join them and you find out that half of your team has been laid off. Right? With all the attendant pressure and frustration and anxiety that would entail. These are the kinds of questions you need to ask, Michael, before you start in that new role. What am I getting myself into? Right? You'd never buy a used car without some kind of detailed report on what you're buying. You'd have a mechanic check it out, right? So why wouldn't you do that for your career? You're entrusting your career potentially to a complete set of unknowns, right? Mm-hmm. So that is the number 1 thing, the due diligence process. Know where you're going. The second and almost equally important thing is, why am I joining this business? Now, it could be for experience. It could be for some boost in compensation. But what's my plan? Why am I doing this? Why am I moving from where I am to where I'm going? Why will it be better? Am I just running away from a position because I'm unhappy? Or am I actually joining a new employer because they're offering me a better opportunity, a greater opportunity? And people need to get out of this dream job mindset because it really doesn't exist. Dream careers are possible. Dream jobs are not. You'll never get everything you want out of a new job. Just understand the why of your moving. And then third, almost the most important aspect of an actual negotiation is negotiate your severance or your exit package on day one. Never leave it to chance what it's going to look like in an at-will world in the United States, for example, where you could be told any day from the first day you start until 3 years from now, this is your last day, because it affects everything. It affects if you have equity, am I going to lose my equity? If I have a bonus, am I going to lose my bonus? If I thought I was going to get some great raise next year, but I'm fired prematurely, I've lost all the value that I thought I was going to get. And worse, if I didn't negotiate the severance, then that means that I could be out on the street dipping into my savings, trying to struggle with all of that because I didn't think about an involuntary separation and what an involuntary. Everyone thinks they're just going to move on their own steam at their own time. And I think we all know in corporate America that is not how it works. You're more likely to be involuntarily separated from the business.
Thanks for highlighting those things. You want to make sure you do your due diligence. You want to make sure it's an on strategy move, and you want to actually negotiate the exit before you enter. And that last point, I think, is really hard to do because, it's sort of like this dating courting process. And basically at the proposal, it's hard to talk about, okay, well, maybe I'll say yes, but what does the divorce look like if it doesn't go well? So it's a hard thing to talk about. Wouldn't you agree?
Right. Well, the most powerful way of doing that in a social context would be this. Imagine if on your first date, you have to decide whether to marry.
Yeah, it'd be hard.
Because that's what you're doing, right? You don't know much about this person, even if it's an 8-hour date, right? They've told you some stories. You haven't actually seen them in any other context. But now they're saying, will you marry me on day one, right? And so you have to be thinking along those lines that this new situation could very well be a spectacular derailleur of your career. I cover this in a blog on my LinkedIn page called Paintings in the Attic, where there was a point in time during COVID where people were hiring like rock stars, right? Massive hiring because they didn't want to miss out. And they thought that COVID was just basically all this pent-up demand. When it wasn't pent-up demand, it was a delay. So at the end of the day, when all the new business didn't come, the 10,000 people hired from this company or that company are instantaneously laid off with nothing more than an apology. Sometimes if they're lucky, they got a good package, but you have to negotiate that in advance. If an employer doesn't have a severance plan or they're not willing to put in writing that you actually are getting a certain severance, you have to think long and hard about whether that's the right place to be. And you cannot accept the trust me, just like we're talking about the marriage. You can't accept, well, you'll just have to trust me. Why would you trust a complete stranger? Right?
I hear you. This episode is brought to you by K. Bassman International, the leader in pharma and biotech recruiting. When pharma executives need to make critical hires, they go to the experts at K. Bassman, pharma's one-source staffing solution. Visit kbic.com. Now back to the episode. And, another paradigm shift about negotiations, offer negotiations, is that your book talks about getting a bigger base salary may not be the best way to negotiate. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So the three dimensions of any offer are not all grounded in compensation, right? So there's the opportunity cost, meaning what's the trade-off of moving from one job to another, whether that's a non-compete or a relocation from one coast to the other and what that will entail for your family, etc. Those are all entailed in the opportunity cost or trade-off, salary bonus or equity forfeiture from moving from one company to another. That's a very big concern. Compensation is the second one, but the most important concern is role. Why is role or position the most important? Because role determines everything. Role determines your span of authority and control. It determines both internally and externally how you're viewed in the marketplace. Am I a CEO or am I a director, right? What's my reporting line look like? because I really have to know if I'm going to be treated fairly, knowing my boss or knowing that I'm reporting to the board, right? And compensation all flows and follows from your role. Every company that's setting a salary band or a salary expectation line is basing it on the position you hold. And in many cases, what I've been able to do is actually negotiate for a better or improved role that takes care of the compensation before the employee even has to negotiate it. I've had great situations where I've moved SVPs into chief medical officer roles, for example, because they realized the person's skill set was so good that they could afford to do that. And without the employee opening her mouth, her salary virtually doubled. Didn't have to do a thing because role rules the world.
That's an interesting concept. Let me also think about, like, if you go from SVP to CMO in that instance, does that normally come with some built-in severance, like this golden parachute thing that people talk about at times?
Yeah, and these days also people have the misconception that somehow they can only get a severance if they have a non-compete. So I found this situation years ago in California where I was negotiating matters for executives out there, and the company would invariably tell me, well, Mr. Matalon, we don't offer severance because we don't require a non-compete, or a non-compete is not lawful in California. And my response was, I don't care. The reason why all executives want a severance actually has nothing to do with a cushion. I'll give you a clue. The reason why executives want some kind of a severance package, a sizable one, is to do something with changing the employer's mindset about terminating their employment. If it becomes too expensive for them, they'll give you the benefit of the doubt. So if you're a CMO making $500,000 a year and the employer knows they'll have to pay 12 months to terminate your employment without cause, they're going to think long and hard about terminating you, won't they? Because $500,000 is about to go out the door. That's why you want a good severance, because severance is a risk mitigator. It's a risk mitigator for your family, but it's also a risk mitigator in your career, right? And I am able to get those because I explained that losing a job, an involuntary separation from a company, is a career derailleur for executives. It doesn't matter whether they have a non-compete or not. They're now in a position where, unfortunately, they've got to dip into their savings to deal with the job market. And the higher your level, as you know, the longer it takes to find a new job. Some CMO positions, for example, take 6 to 9 months to find.
It's true.
And if you're sitting there without a severance, I mean, can you imagine personally what that impact would be, assuming you're not fortunate enough to have a spouse that's working?
Right.
Horrible, horrible situation.
That's very interesting stuff. Thanks for sharing that. And I really did enjoy that section of the book. There was another thing about your book that made me scratch my head a little bit, because even as an executive recruiter, I make a living by people changing jobs. But my default setting is to encourage people to stay at their company. So I was really surprised with how your book was so pro job change. So describe the concept of job decay.
Right. So again, we're talking, as you say, about the growth or the outgrowth of a human being where they no longer fit the shirt. And that occurs all day long because businesses cannot support you in your career over a 60-year period, right? Over time, two things usually happen in a job. The job decays in value because you hit the ceiling, or you suffer from what we call the law of diminishing return, right? I like to analogize that to you do a workout and you drink a glass of water, it's thirst quenching. Now drink a gallon of water. How much thirst quenching is actually going on? You're doing nothing but filling up your stomach with water, right? Law of diminishing returns. I'm doing the same job every day, 5 days a week, without growth, without new opportunity, etc. One of two things will happen. You will become less enchanted with the job because the job has less value to you, or worse, you'll become so distracted by how unhappy you are with the job that your employer is going to involuntarily separate you because you're not performing well, right? Getting to 100% performance in a job means that you're going to drop or diminish out of that 100% over time. So jobs decay. It's just like buying a car and then going back to the dealership after you've driven it around the blocks. You know what? I don't really want this car. They'll say, well, I can't give it back to you for the same price because the car's depreciated in value. All jobs decay, which is why executives have to keep pushing for greater and greater value in their current positions and in new ones in order to stay ahead of that depreciation or decay.
It's similar to I get this from a lot from candidates that call. They can't pinpoint what the pain is. Like, I want to change jobs because it's almost like this, it just feels like the right time, or, I'm ready for something new.
Right.
And that's that job decay sitting in.
Right. Well, think about it this way. There's a reason why most stock options are 4 years.
Yeah.
Right? Yep. Is the employer saying, we're going to continue to give you more and more stock every year? Sometimes if you're lucky, they'll offer you a new plan. They'll offer you more options. But right now, all you've got is that 4 years. Why? They don't necessarily expect that you're going to actually stick around. And in fact, some of the PE firms now have changed to a 5-year plan because they know you'll never get that 5th year. So they're actually offering the same options spread over 5 years, knowing they're going to take some back, right?
Yeah.
It's how human beings operate. If we're in the same position, unless something has changed where the job has increasing value to us, whether it's in our compensation or our experience, it's time to go. You've outgrown the job. It's time to get something new. And by the way, market conditions usually outpace anything an employer is willing to. So you know this firsthand, right? You get a job. A year later, if I called you and I said, what am I worth in the marketplace? You say, probably 20% more than you're making now. Well, why is that? Because the marketplace is looking at you objectively based on value. Employers stop that process. They're looking at you subjectively. Howard is good at this. He's not good at that. We don't think financially it would be a good idea to give Howard a raise this year, but I could get another 50 grand out in the market, because the market doesn't look at it that way. The market looks like Howard has gained another year of experience as a CMO. We're going to reward him if we can lure him out of that.
It's true. Like there's times where like a big pharma company may want to increase salaries by 6%, 5%. And they do that, but it's like an act of Congress and it takes them a whole year to get it passed. Well, by the time they just increased it, they almost need to do it again. They're behind again.
Right. I had a situation years ago with someone who was moving into a COO role. And they looked at the salary and they said to me, Howard, this is about 50% less than really what I'd like. And I said to this individual, do they think that you have enormous value now from an expectation standpoint? And he said, yes. I said, can you produce wine from water? Because at double your salary, the expectations on you will be so extreme as to make the job entirely uncomfortable. And that's, to a certain extent, how companies look at individuals, that there's a certain value. You can't go beyond a certain value because then you're bumping up against individuals who are in a higher bracket, higher role, right? It's always a conundrum, particularly for big pharma, to figure out the right salary bands, because every time they adjust one, they're adjusting others, right? But for the individual, you have to stop worrying about what the company thinks. What you have to figure out is, where am I in my career based on my investment in my career, and can I do better elsewhere? That's the real question.
Good points. One of the things that I get asked a lot about from candidates is about non-competes. It seems like everyone in the pharma industry, maybe outside of those in states that just don't do non-competes, has one. Right. And, from your vantage point, the people listening, some of them are individual contributors and some of them are all the way to C-suite. And so there might not be a one, brush stroke answer for everyone, but do non-competes have teeth, or when do they and when do they not?
Sure. So non-competes have changed a lot, and there was recently a federal push by the Biden administration to disband non-competes altogether, which hasn't happened. Every state is in the process, one way or another, of reevaluating their non-compete laws. Some states have outright bans like California. Other states have salary caps where if the salary isn't at a certain level, you can't have them. And some states just allow them whatever kind of terms you want, as long as those terms are reasonable in scope and basis of what the business does, a protectable interest. But the problem that a lot of employees have is they're not thinking about it practically. The question I always get is this non-compete legal? It's actually the wrong question to ask. The right question to ask is, will a prospective employer looking at what I just signed agree to hire me or face the wrath of the former company who is now thinking about suing them for hiring me, right? Forget about the teeth, right? The value proposition has to be looked at two ways. One, does my current employer actually enforce these non-competes? And what happens if they're not? A lot of employers, for example, will tie non-competes into stock options and say, you violate this thing, we're either going to claw back options or we're going to forfeit options. And if you have a lot of them, right, that otherwise you would have months to vest or exercise, you want to be concerned about that because you don't want to chase after options that the employer thinks you forfeited. But the prospective employers out there are all litigation adverse. And if they think hiring you is going to violate that non-compete and subject them to liability, that's what you have to be concerned about. So you can't just sign on the dotted line what the non-competes say. What you need to do is see if there's a way to narrow the non-competes. There's a number of ways of doing them, whether it's changing their business definition or their geographic scope, or making sure it's tied only to what you've done or you've seen while you've worked for the employer. Those are the kind of changes that as lawyers we look to make in non-competes. And it's critical that if you have a concern about a non-compete that you bring it to a lawyer or a coach to look at.
Yeah, that's good advice. Because that's also a tenuous time to try to negotiate, and that's all the more reason why maybe negotiating this up front is important. But again, it's very hard when a company puts a non-compete in front of you and you're about to sign the offer. It's hard to negotiate the non-compete right then.
That's right.
Any advice on what to do there?
So when an employer is at the point where and this has changed over the last couple of years, I've had very good success at having my clients, either I will help them directly by involving myself in the negotiation, but more likely than not, I empower them to lead the negotiation. So we'll attack the definition of the business, right? So for example, if it says the business of the company is pharma, well, that's not going to fly. What specific sector is it in? Oncology, right? What kind of drug development does it do, for example? A lot of the time, these businesses will actually rethink their business definitions to accommodate, if you have the leverage, to accommodate hiring you because they know this is a critical concern. And anyone who's been the subject of a non-compete, who's been out of work for a year in pharma, knows how stale they become. A year is a lifetime. It's a lifetime.
It is.
So make sure that the non-compete is actually not going to prevent you from actually continuing to work during the course of a year. You should never look at it as, well, I'm being paid to sit on the sideline. Being sidelined for a year is a death sentence in pharma. You don't want to be sidelined. You want to be able to get another job in pharma that doesn't run afoul of the non-compete terms.
Good advice. I'm going to switch gears here on you because sometimes I get candidates that call me, and when they do that, they've really made the decision in their heart that they're going to change companies. And conventional wisdom says, well, line up a job before you resign.
Right.
But you present in your book a way to part ways with a company proactively, get a severance in the process. Can you kind of outline how that's properly done?
So this is what we call the accountability process. There are a number of situations like the paintings in the attic we talked about where the employer hires, they had no idea what to do with an individual. The individual is effectively sidelined on the day they start, which is extraordinarily tragic. The company is aware of that. And so what I recommend to people who are going through this, first, you need to get a coach because you need to have someone gather your thoughts. They don't have to be a lawyer necessarily, but they have to be someone who understands how careers work because you need to marshal your thoughts and take the emotions and the frustration out of the process because you really only get one shot at it. And then what you're doing is you're methodically walking the employer through what happened in your career and why you need to go. Why either your career was mishandled, where the failures were, and sometimes, you have other leverage, Michael, like you feel like you're the victim of discrimination or discriminatory conduct, where they're not adhering to the terms and conditions of their agreement. And, one of the other things we always try to bake into agreements at the highest level is what we call a good reason clause, which says if the employer fails to deliver on its promises, such as forcing you to relocate, changing your role, on its own, changing your reporting line from the CEO to now a division president, which has hurt you because you no longer have the same optics and visibility, you get to walk out with a severance. Now, if you have none of that, the best thing to do is to sit down with the company and say, look, things haven't worked out the way that we wanted to. You could continue to pay me and I could continue to limp along in this job. Or what we can do is we can put a package together where I get to walk out the door. You're in fact saving money because you would have kept me on for another year. And all I'm looking for is 6 months of severance. Businesses are smart. I don't know why people think otherwise. However, I will say this. You always have to run the risk when you approach the company and say, you owe me something, that they disagree with you. And when that happens, your only choices are to walk out without a severance or hope they don't fire you because they see you as very disenchanted with your position. So plan B is important, at least starting the planning. Never start an accountability discussion where your process of moving on is not already underway.
Good advice. Now, some of the people that are listening have never utilized an executive coach before. You've outlined some of the benefits already, but what are maybe some of the other benefits that an executive coach can offer?
Well, it's really funny because we go through life in our, from the time that we're little kids until our teenage years, and we have a coach for everything. We have our piano coach. We have our baseball coach. We have our guidance counselors. We have a billion people that are there to help us. And then we become adults and we get through college and it's like George Bush on the carrier, mission accomplished, right? Mm-hmm. Well, what have we accomplished? The reason why we got coaches during our early years is because they helped us train and study and learn what we didn't know. Careers are no different. You could be an ace subject matter expert in oncology, but you have absolutely no idea how to negotiate for yourself. Well, why would you? That's not actually your field of expertise. Your field of expertise is in a study. It's not in career negotiations. Yeah. That's why you need a coach. You need a coach to tell you whether or not you're being compensated properly. You need a coach to tell you if the role is a good fit. You need a coach potentially to even tell you what you need to know about the business that you're about to join, right? Which is why you want to go out at least and look at, websites like a Comparably and say, well, what is this business like? Or a Glassdoor. Well, what would it be like to actually work there? All of these are really coaching facilities, right? And you need a good recruiter. No shameless plug for you.
Yeah, thank you.
But the truth is that why, if you know that you're not going to pay for a recruiter because the recruiter works for the company, why not leverage the resource you have that's free, completely free, and go to Michael, what's a CMO making in California these days? I want to work in San Francisco. You'd probably have the answer right off the top of your head. But I don't know that answer unless I have the metrics, I have the data. So why would I assume that the first offer an employer is offering me is market? Why? Right? So this is another great analogy. So imagine that you go to a garage sale and you're an unscrupulous buyer and you're rummaging around and you find a Picasso with a little sticker on it that says $5, right? The honest person might go up to them and say, look, I just want to let you know what you're about to give up. The dishonest person steals the painting for $5 and brings it to the art show where he sells it for $5 million, right? Employers are no different. It's a free market economy. If I know I could get you for $100,000, even though you're worth $500,000, why would I do that? What's the advantage to me? In fact, I'm looking for bargains all day as the employer. I'll take whatever I can get. And I'd be thrilled to get people of high caliber for low dollars. That's right. You need coaches. Everyone needs coaches. It never stops. It never, ever stops.
Well, how can someone find NAV Consulting? What's the website?
So NAV Scoring is a website. I don't do shameless plugs. This is why the discussion on NAV is only 2 pages in the 125 plus page book. Our goal is to put people in a better place, and I found that. I'm in my 50s. This is all a legacy play. I have 4 daughters, and my wife knows that they would never let me live it any other way. We need to be doing better for the human condition. I think we're all forgetting that we are, ironically, at the top of the pyramid, but we're not taking care of each other. And we need to really understand that every employer is subject to a whole bunch of human beings all looking for meaning, right? And if they're not going to look out for us, we need to look out for each other. So NAV scoring is one great way of assessing where you are in your career, whether you're in the right place or whether you need coaching, either to help you with a resume or to help you with a problem within your job or to move you to a better place. And that's what we're
Wonderful. Well, sadly, Howard, that's all the time we have. But on behalf of all in the Pharmaverse, I just want to thank you for your time and your insights. They were extremely valuable. I gained a lot from it. And I really want to thank you for being a guest on the Pharmaverse.
thrilled to be here. And if there's anything I can do to help you or your viewers, please reach.
Great. Well, Howard Matalon is on LinkedIn. As you heard, his website is navscoring.com, and you can find his book, Navigating Career Negotiations, on Amazon. But that wraps up another episode of the Pharmaverse. We have many more great guests lined up for you, so follow the podcast so you don't miss any of them. Thanks for listening, and see you next time in the Pharmaverse. Thanks for joining us on the Pharmaverse podcast. Make sure you subscribe below so you don't miss any leadership insights. Like and comment. I would love to hear from you. We'll see you on the next episode of Pharmaverse.